been on a very consistent political line for a very long time. Yet it's only when Israel is conducting a blood-chilling genocide in Gaza that we find ourselves hauled up before the courts in order to suddenly defend ourselves against the accusation that the anti-Zionism that I have been espousing for years, suddenly that becomes anti-Semitism. The minute that, or suddenly it becomes important enough to justify this legal rigmarole that we're being put through. So it seems very clear that what lies behind this action is a very concerted attempt to shore up the crumbling credit that Israel has in public opinion in many parts of Australia.
You know that there are things going on, terrible crimes that are going on, that the IDF are committing in the West Bank and Gaza and elsewhere. You know there are atrocities. Some things turn your stomachs, and yet you do nothing. You act as if you don't want to know. This culture of indifference is among the most perverse effects of lawfare. It's in this context that the defense of free speech becomes hugely important, and the role of universities as laboratories of free speech.
Salamat everyone. You are listening to Red Inverted Triangle. This show is about the ongoing struggle for liberation in Palestine, produced on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Like Palestine, Australia is a ground zero of a genocide that has been occurring for over 200 years and continues to this day. From the river to the sea, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Ahmed. I am a Palestinian living on this stolen land, and I'll be your host. This podcast aims to provide the Palestinian story, Palestinian narrative. It's necessary because we live in a heavily indoctrinated society where, as Palestinians, being able to speak, to tell our stories, and narrate is the ultimate form of resistance. That's right. Resistance, hence the name of our show, Red Inverted Triangle. Each week, we'll be bringing you different segments, such as news updates from Palestine, Palestinian music, interviews with Palestinian figures or non-Palestinian figures talking about Palestine, and everything else related to Palestine. Thanks for tuning in, and long live the resistance. This episode of Red Inverted Triangle, we are bringing you a conversation I've had with Professor John Keane and Dr. Nick Riemer. John and Nick are Sydney University academics who have been taken to the federal court as their own colleagues lodged an anti-Semitism complaint against them. The reason? Being outspoken against the State of Israel's genocide in Gaza. John Keane is a professor of politics at the University of Sydney. His latest book is Thinking About Democracy in Turbulent Times, Sorbonne Lectures 2025. His open letter on Israel, Palestine, genocide and toleration helped trigger the lawfare case against him and Nick Riemer. Dr. Nick Reimer is a linguistics academic at the University of Sydney and long-term participant in the Palestine Solidarity Movement in Australia. He is the author of Boycott Theory and the Struggle for Palestine in 2023 on the academic boycott of Israel. Nick and John spoke about the legal warfare waged against them by their colleagues at the University of Sydney on behalf of the Israel lobby, particularly because of their advocacy for Palestine and for being outspoken against the Israeli genocide in Gaza. I hope you'll find my conversation with Nick and John useful and productive. Enjoy. John and Nick, some argue that these lawsuits brought under Australia's Racial Discrimination Act against you amount to lawfare, an attempt to muzzle criticism of Israel and its atrocities and war crimes committed, in occupied Palestine against the Palestinians. Some also argue that this legal case against you is so important and so critical for the Palestine Solidarity Movement because if the university colleagues succeed, then criticism of Zionism and the State of Israel and its actions and war crimes and genocide will be considered anti-Semitic. This is an attempt on behalf of the Israel lobby to silence any criticism of Zionism, the founding political ideology of the State of Israel. Incidentally, an ideology that once upon a time was deemed racist and racially discriminatory by the United Nations Resolution 3379 in 1975. But maybe that's probably for another discussion. There's seemingly an active effort on behalf of the management of academic institutions, the likes of University of Sydney, to exaggerate the prevalence of anti-Semitism on campuses. In the context of University of Sydney, just a couple of weeks ago, on Friday, the 31st of October, 2025, in response to the anti-Semitism in New South Wales inquiry, University of Sydney's Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor Professor Anna Marie clearly stated in a letter that under its policies, the University of Sydney does not make specific findings of anti-Semitism. I want to start with you, John. I mentioned the word lawfare, but before I go into this with you, can you talk a little bit about the allegations made against you? Because you have specific allegations made against you by your colleagues than those made against Nick. So could you speak to that in some details? What are these allegations? And also, if you could put it within context of what do we mean by lawfare? And because, how does it feel to be a victim of such a lawfare?
Yes, the case against me is slightly different than that against Nick. I would summarize the case against me in terms of what we could call a toxic formula. And the toxic formula, to put it in one sentence, is that I'm accused of support for terrorism, and I'm also accused of actually bringing harm to a group of colleagues who are, I would say, unconditional supporters of the state of Israel. So harm, humiliation, belittling is equal. All of this, support for terrorism, the harmful statements made by me to these colleagues equals anti-Semitism. Now, those who have joined us, and you as well, I'm sure, must be wondering about the non sequiturs of all of this. I mean, it's a sort of jumbled formula, but it's toxic in the sense that it bundles together two issues and draws the conclusion that I am in breach of Section 18C of the Human Rights Act, that actually I have a long history of hatred of Jews. None of this is true. It's nonsense. The question about lawfare, well, we know that this is a portmanteau word to describe a certain misuse and abuse of courts. If we just draw back for a moment, Ahmed, and think about the sort of standard view of what goes on in courts, it's likened often to a game of chess. You know, there are precise rules and the moves are very calculated, and the aim is, of course, to defeat an opponent in inside the four walls of a court. In fact, and the aim is to bring justice in a dispute about who gets what, when, and how. This is the standard, let's say, game of chess view of what law is. It's heavily rule-bound, it aims to bring certainty, it aims to bring justice, and it's all done non-violently. No guns or knives in the courtroom, and so on. Lawfare is this, plus the gamification, the weaponization of these legal procedures for political ideological ends. The aim is to crush opponents using lawfare, using the courts, ruining reputations, getting in our case, getting us sacked, upsetting our family life, and in the end, the aim is to get a windfall, into already deep pockets. Mm-hmm. This is the weaponization of law. This is the abuse of rule of law procedures. This is lawfare, a word that has come into being about 25 years ago and describes very well, this portmanteau word describes very well the sort of strange combination of warfare tactics, destruction of an opponent, of an enemy on the one hand, and the use of rule of law procedures. What's it like to go through such lawfare? Well, the aim is to upset, to waste time, our time, to bankrupt us in the end somehow, and to bring to silence the public talk that has erupted since October the 7th of Israeli genocide. So Nick and I are caught up in a sort of textbook case of lawfare, and here we are.
And it's also a distraction, probably. I mean, all the work that you could be doing to support the Palestinian cause externally and internally, and the movement as well, you're being distracted by this kind of huge lawfare, if you will. But, lawfare has like this negative connotation to it. How does it generally affect, our democratic rights and academic rights in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and protest? How does that lawfare affect all these values that we hold dear?
Yeah, at the heart of our case is the defense of the principle of freedom of speech in public. In practice, this lawfare feels to me as though it has such effects, negative effects, such as wasting a lot of our time. Enormous amounts of time have to be put into this case, are being put into this case by our legal team and by Nick and by me. The aim of lawfare is to try to induce anxiety into the bodies, if you like, of the accused. Actually, it's having, in my case, the opposite effect. It's almost as if I've become a little more Buddhist in the sense that I'm committed to not allowing that to happen. This lawfare aims to induce a kind of self-censorship, that in situations where you should speak, you know that you should, for the sake of justice, for the sake of truth, say things. You zip your lips. It's a formula for trying to spread a culture of self-censorship. Of course, it has silencing effects, and I think I can speak for myself since this case began more than a year ago. I have become very aware of the need to watch my back all the time and not to say certain things, because it could actually end in our defeat in this case. I would also say that this lawfare, as I experience it, is it has highlighted to me the problem of indifference. That's a word that we use lightly, but if you look at the recent great film of Jonathan Glazer, Zone of Interest, Jewish-British filmmaker, indifference is so this lawfare is designed to promote a culture of indifference, not only among the accused, but among the supporters of the accused and of the wider public. What is indifference? Indifference is not ignorance. You know that there are things going on, terrible crimes that are going on, that the IDF are committing in the West Bank and Gaza and elsewhere. You know there are atrocities. Some things turn your stomachs, and yet you do nothing. You act as if you don't want to know those things. It's as it were, you build a wall between yourself and those things. This culture of indifference is, I think, among the most perverse effects of lawfare. It's in this context that the defense of free speech becomes hugely important, and the role of universities as laboratories of free speech. Universities almost everywhere in the West are under intense pressure because of this issue, and the silencing that's going on, the cultivation of indifference among colleagues and students and so on is manifest. It's in this period that I speak for myself. This case is a defense of free speech. And it has forced me to think about the history of the whole principle of free speech. Why is it so important? Well, once upon a time, it's probably a Western invention. It had theological roots. John Milton, the great English poet and writer, justified freedom of speech on the grounds that this would allow the devil to, circulate freely in human affairs, and thereby put all Protestant Christians, on edge and live better lives in order that they may make it to paradise. Later, there were justifications of freedom of speech on the basis of truth with a capital T, and we still talk like that. I'm not such a capital T truth man. What I do think is that this lawfare has taught me that there's another justification, a very 21st century justification of freedom of speech, which is that it is a weapon against reigning orthodoxies, particularly orthodoxies that are entangled in cruelty and humiliation and genocide. And therefore, freedom of speech is the struggle to bring accountability, to break up, the monopoly of views that Zionists have been exercising in many countries.
It's interesting you spoke about the cultural indifference. I had a conversation with a previous guest, Reverend Dr. Nick Reimer, and he spoke about the cultural Zionists as well. Like, if we are culturally indifferent, and we're getting all our news from the mainstream media and academic institutions that are really suppressed to speak openly about everything, we are actually culturally Zionists by nature, kind of thing. But I do want to go to Nick and just speak a little bit about the kind of different allegations made against you. Within this concept of lawfare, there are different allegations made against you by your colleagues at uni. Can you just speak a little bit to those, and particularly, I really want you to speak about how dangerous are these allegations within the context of conflation of criticism of Israel and the state of Zionism and the state of Israel and their war crimes in Gaza, and being labeled as an anti-Semite or a Judophobe of that sort. So could you talk to these allegations for everyone just to understand?
Yes, of course, Ahmed. The allegations against me are broadly congruent with the ones against John. So our opponents are accusing both of us of, supporting terrorism. In my case, they've picked out various things that I've said at public demonstrations or published in articles and claimed absurdly that I'm calling for, a violent uprising against Jewish people. They claim that my criticisms of Zionism are code for criticisms of Jewish people, even though, obviously, by many accounts, there are more Christian Zionists in the world than there are Jewish ones. And if we were being serious about who counts as a Zionist in today's landscape, we'd have to point first and foremost to people like Chris Minns, the stultifyingly Zionist Premier of New South Wales, who, to my knowledge, is not Jewish. So the idea that our opponents are trying to have the courts validate is the idea that any criticism of Zionism can only be a criticism of Judaism, and that it is therefore an instance of racial discrimination and hate speech, which should be punished under the Racial Discrimination Act. And of course, the big carrot in this for them is that if the court finds in their favour, they will have set a very damaging precedent, which will go well beyond some of the findings that have already been made on this question by the federal court, among others. So in the Wertheim and Haddad judgment, which was talked about quite extensively some months ago, the judge in that case, Justice Stewart, said very clearly that anti-Zionism was not anti-Semitism and needed to be distinguished from it. But that judgment was not binding. That was the judge's opinion. It was part of the reasoning that he used to reach the judgment in that case he did, but it doesn't bind further courts. And what our lawyers tell us is that the way that the case against John and me is framed is such that the decision that Justice Kennett makes in our case, hopefully next year, will be binding. We hope, of course, that it will be a decision that unequivocally validates our position, which is that anti-Zionism is criticism of a particular political ideology. Anti-Semitism is a disgusting and abhorrent form of racial discrimination, which John and I reject categorically, as we reject Islamophobia, as we reject racism against Aboriginal or Asian people. But our opponents want the exact opposite conclusion. They want a big rubber stamp from the court, which will allow anyone who espouses anti-Zionism to immediately be made vulnerable to the kind of legal proceedings that we're going through, which are designed, as John has already said, to have us denounced as anti-Semites, to expose us to significant legal costs and perhaps damages, to make it untenable for our employer to continue employing us, and to send a very strong message that anyone who sticks their head above the parapet and tries to say similar things will meet the same fate. So the silencing effects that John has talked about are, I think, very real, and they're a significant spin-off for our Zionist opponents here. They really do want to muzzle any kind of discourse that goes against the interests of the state of Israel. And it's very telling to me that John and I have been on I think, a very consistent political line for a very long time. I've been a consistent anti-Zionist, a consistent proponent of Palestinian rights for a long time. Yet it's only when Israel is conducting a blood-chilling genocide in Gaza that we find ourselves hauled up before the courts in order to suddenly defend ourselves against the accusation that the anti-Zionism that I have been espousing for years, suddenly that becomes anti-Semitism. The minute that, or suddenly it becomes important enough to justify this legal rigmarole that we're being put through. So it seems very, very clear that what lies behind this action on some level is a very concerted attempt to shore up the crumbling credit that Israel has in public opinion in many parts of Australia. And I think we can say that, the fanaticism of Israel's supporters in the West is completely in phase with the scale of the state of Israel's crimes. And as Israel becomes more and more criminal, as it adds genocide to apartheid, to ethnic cleansing, its supporters in Australia and elsewhere find it even more necessary to go on this extremely sort of offensive, this offensive against us, because I think they appreciate that they're losing public opinion, or that they have lost public opinion. So their only recourse now is through the formal apparatus of the state. That's why they try to get demonstrations banned. They go after people like John and me in lawfare. They lobby politicians continually. Politicians in New South Wales are in many respects, with only a few honourable exceptions, members of the most backward sector of this society, and they are I think the most well inclined or well disposed to these kinds of lobbying efforts. And it's for reasons like that that we see such this feverish activity on the part of Zionists to lobby, to use lawfare, to suppress this massive wave of popular sentiment, which is everywhere in society, which opposes genocide and opposes Israel.
You talk about the crumbling structure of Zionism and kind of the state of Israel. I've been reading Ilan Pappé's recent book, Israel on the Brink, and in his previous book is also talking about how, the Israel lobby internationally or externally moves as the Israeli government moved to more and more to the right and more to the conservatism. And now it's blatantly kind of messianic taste to it. And on top of that, you talking about the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The biggest danger right now is the adoption of IHRA definition of anti-Semitism in academic institutions and elsewhere, which is a clear danger that we all really need to be aware of. The IHRA definition is being adopted in community councils, in city councils, and that's really important to be made aware of. But I mean, I want to talk about the lawfare and how do we, what would be a good strategy to combat or, proactively fight these kind of lawfare, in your opinion, Nick?
Yes, I think that's the key question, Ahmed. I mean, the first thing to say perhaps is that we do have to fight it. We could choose to be silenced. We could choose to self-censor. We could choose to make it someone else's responsibility to fight Zionism and to stand with Palestinians. But we shouldn't. We shouldn't. And I'm not talking about John and me here. I'm talking about members of the Palestine solidarity community generally, and anyone of goodwill who is, horrified by what they've seen unfold in Gaza since the 7th of October in the year before last, and feels that moral need and political need that John was referring to earlier to speak out against it. Either people can think, oh, it's just too complicated, I'm not a very courageous sort of person, that's who I am, or they can oppose genocide. It's a very clear choice that I think does confront each and every one of us in very stark terms, and that we need to take very seriously. And the fact that those who do speak out are now threatened with lawfare just highlights the need for organisation, I think, on our side of this question. And one of the very gratifying things that John and I have experienced, I think, is just the outpouring of support that we have seen from people who have stepped forward with extraordinary generosity to crowdfund the legal team that we have working for us. The legal team that is in our corner is itself extraordinarily generous and doing lots of a vast quantity of unpaid work because they believe in our cause. And I think this all points to just the need that we have to not be intimidated, to continue saying the things that we are currently being, hauled into court for, which we know are not anti-Semitic. We know they are just a political position in favor of justice and equality for everyone. And the key thing is not to give Zionists what they want, which is to silence us. So if anything, I think we need the kind of experience that John and I are going through to embolden everybody in the movement to speak out more forthrightly and with greater determination than they already have, because there are limits to the numbers of people that the Zionists can drag through the legal system. And a point will come where the courts make it clear that the kind of speech that we have indulged in is not racially discriminatory, and we will be vindicated. I mean, if we get the opposite result, then that will be an entire game changer for the movement, and we will have some very, very serious strategizing and political decisions that will need to be made about how to prosecute anti-Zionism in an Australia that has declared it illegal. But I very much hope, and our advice is that that is extremely unlikely, and that cases like this are extremely likely to win. So we should be confident that we have the law on our side. We need to organise to pool resources to fund future lawfare cases that Zionists bring against us. That's something that is lacking at the moment in Australia. There's no equivalent to an organisation like Palestine Legal in the United States. We badly need one. But most immediately, the key thing is that we need to continue advocating for justice for Palestinians, and indeed for everyone between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, just as loudly and just as unambiguously as we have been previously.
Couldn't agree more. John, I want to go to you about something you've written recently in Michael West Media, which is a great outlet and platform. I encourage everyone to go and follow Michael West's and his work, and all the great journalists, Wendy Bacon and Stephanie and Yaakov Aharon. You asked what motivates Zionists to misuse courts to hunt down their opponents, the likes of yourself and Nick, in that article. You said that aside from such obvious facts as defending their own views, intimidation and silencing of opponents, and dreams of big financial windfalls into already deep pockets, there's usually something much deeper going on: revenge. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Sure. One of the effects of this case is, in me as a writer, is to dig deeper, to think as nuanced and as complicated as I can about the deeper significance of this case. And I have in mind a series which I'm going to write about a variety of matters, such as evil, for instance. It's coming soon. Revenge was my opening shot, so to say. I mean, it has become obvious to me, and I think Nick has a very similar view on this, that there's something very deep at work in this lawfare. You've mentioned some of the motives, the dreams of a financial windfall, the silencing of us and all critics of Zionist Israel. But revenge seems to me to be a disposition, a malady that's at work in cases of this kind, lawfare cases of this kind. What is revenge? Well, my grandmother would have said that, revenge is kind of part of human nature. This is how things are. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Getting even is it's a human instinct. Actually, I think that's not true, with great respect and love to my grandmother, because there is a literature on revenge that's worth reading. And what I did in the last couple of months was actually go through this literature, whose main point is that it's a malady. It's not, so to say, normal, that revenge is typically driven by fanaticism, as Nick has said, or a kind of messianic view, as you have said, Ahmed. It's typically a disposition that is fueled by trauma. That there is a trauma in one's early childhood, for instance, or there's a trauma that has happened to a whole people, the near genocide of Jews by Nazism and by the Soviet Union. And this sense, this deep sense of a trauma that still haunts the living, even a generation or two beyond the original act of great violence, is something that generates a kind of narcissism. You know, this, I'm just using words that you will find in psychoanalytic studies of revenge, where the traumatized become very preoccupied. It is that they have done no wrong, they have been the objects of great harm, and this narcissism then feeds into what psychoanalysts call splitting, you know, where you begin to form a dualism between good and evil, between friend and enemy. And it's this bundle of motives, very strange, really. I don't have inside me, I think Nick doesn't either, many streaks of revenge, but some people are obsessed with revenge, and it seems to me they won't like this kind of talk, but revenge is one of these deeper dynamics at work in this lawfare case. One of the consequences of that is not only that any criticism of Zionism or any criticism of the state of Israel, its history, its founding, the great violence that led to the formation of the state, and all the behavior since 1948. One consequence, of course, is that they want to silence all of that. But there's something as toxic at work in this revenge, as I see it, which is that they want to obliterate memories of Jewish people whose mitzvahs were different. Think of Einstein, think of Hannah Arendt, think of Primo Levi, think of Bob Dylan, think of Daniel Barenboim, today Jeffrey Sachs. These were Jewish people for whom culture, learning, cosmopolitanism, nonviolence, etc., were really fundamental values, cosmopolitan values. And needless to say, these Jewish people had no truck with Zionism. They didn't like it. And they didn't like the violence. They didn't like the scattering of peoples who had lived in a land for 2 millennia and so on. So the question about revenge that I wrote about is, the question that arises is, is it possible we're living through a period where Zionists, those full of revenge, will actually give up, soften themselves? Short answer is, I think it's highly unlikely. And it's for this reason that they shall have to be defeated in court.
We definitely hope that this will be the outcome of your case, at least. But Nick, I wanna bring it back to the situation on campus at the moment. You're teaching at Sydney Uni. What is the current atmosphere right now at the Sydney Uni when it comes to activism for Palestine? We used to see, the encampments, student encampments. We used to see constant rallies on campus. Is there any clear signs of silencing of students and academics? I mean, do you get any feedback from students on this? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, sure. We talk to students all the time. There's a very vigorous and vibrant Palestine solidarity community on the campus, which cuts across staff and students. Maybe the key thing to say is that the university is putting us under pressure, but there's no way that we're stopping. The most recent thing, I suppose, that we can point to on the Sydney University campus was the event that we hosted with Chris Hedges, the famous ex-New York Times war correspondent who visited Australia not all that long ago. And the Staff for Palestine group at Sydney University hosted a lunchtime talk that he did, and we did that in collaboration with two academic departments, with the Department of History and the Department of Media and Communications. And I think that it tells us something about the growing normalization of opposition to genocide and a growing normalization of a political stance in favor of Palestine, that two academic departments were perfectly prepared to put their name to this talk as sponsors, despite the controversy that has surrounded the issue. And this was a very heartening to me piece of evidence of what I was talking about before, precisely the fact that there are people who are prepared not to be silenced, and for whom this horror that we've all been witnessing since October the 7th, 2023, is just shoring up and increasing, supercharging their ability or their willingness to speak out. So that was extremely positive for me. I think we can say probably that in many parts of the university, support for Palestine is now the default position. My impression among my students in the Faculty of Arts is that that is almost universal, almost universal. It's worth saying, I think, that the university administration itself is a very clear exception to that generalization. The university administration, in the form of its Vice-Chancellor, Mark Scott, its his second in command, Professor Anna Marie Jagos, the university executive, the Senate, have done absolutely nothing to stand against the genocide. They have said absolutely nothing about the wholesale destruction of Palestinian higher education. They've done nothing. Even the Faculty of Health and Medicine at the university has refused to make any statement about the blood-curdling destruction that Israel has repeatedly wreaked against the medical and healthcare infrastructure of Gaza. And the administration of the University of Sydney, quite to the contrary, has gone so far as to agree to host former IDF soldiers in a gala event in the university's main administration building. It's banned pro-Palestinian cake stalls. It's introduced a suite of extraordinarily repressive measures which are designed to prevent protest on campus, prevent people putting up posters on campus. And there's no point pretending that that hasn't had some dampening effect on at least those modes of support for Palestine on campus. And I think people like Mark Scott and Professor Jagos are responsible for some of the most, serious missteps morally and politically that we have seen from any in Australian universities in the entirety of their history. I think this is among the most serious manifestations of the fundamentally compliant, conformist, conservative, genocidal mindset that apparently governs Australian higher education, and that Aboriginal people and their supporters and others have been pointing to for far longer than we have. And it's not just Sydney University, it's the Australian higher education sector as a whole, and it's compounded by the very real kinds of financial constraints that the universities find themselves under. Governments of both political colours would like nothing more, I think, than to place universities firmly under the thumb of the economy, so that they were no longer any kind of sort of arena in which dangerous ideas can be expressed. But it's very encouraging that there are so many staff and students who are determined for that not to happen. The final thing I might just mention, because I don't think it's well known enough, is that the other side of the pro-Palestinian presence on campus is a very concerted pro-Zionist presence. We know that Sydney University has scores of members of the so-called 5A network, the Australian Academic Alliance Against Anti-Semitism, which is a lobby group that operates within universities to coordinate lawfare and to, weaponize the internal disciplinary and code of conduct processes that large organizations like universities have against Palestine supporters. And they are responsible for scores of internal complaints against staff. And one thing that I'll just end on, if you don't mind, it's worth just saying that among the members of this organization are former members of the IDF. So among our colleagues at the university are people who have had, to the information we see is correct, quite senior roles in the Israeli so-called defense forces and the occupation forces. So one person in particular that I'm thinking of, and I'm just going on information that was publicly available and of which this person made no secret, was an advanced training instructor for the IDF, admittedly more than 20 years ago, but boasted on their LinkedIn page of having been responsible for advanced training for groups of more than 30 soldiers in the IDF. So I think there are very real questions that the university should be asking about the involvement of its staff members, both the historical involvement and the current involvement of members of staff, paid members of staff, with an army that is complicit with genocide, responsible for genocide. And, how many members of staff are there on the University of Sydney who we can justifiably raise questions over their complicity in war crimes? That is a genuine question. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think it should be raised.
It's unbelievable. You can't even make these things up. It's just, it's incredible. But John, I mean, this system of silencing in academic institutions in Australia and governments in general, firmly standing up with Israel, with the state of Israel during the genocide over the past 25 months. What does that tell us about the West in general and Western academic institutions?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ahmed, and I'm rather lost in thought, and I think many other intellectuals are, and we're witnessing the first production of very good essays and books that make the point that there is something different, unfortunately, about this genocide. I mean, yes, we've witnessed previous genocides. There's one going on in Myanmar, in Sudan, and the list grows longer. But I'm pretty convinced that this unfinished genocide committed by Israel is of historic significance, and I hesitate in talking like that. I'm not a big fan of grand generalizations, but grand generalizations are sometimes needed, and I think this is a period in which they are really urgent. There are several things that since October the 7th, let's not memorialize it. We know about the 100-year war on Palestinians, Rashid Khalid, and so on. But since October the 7th, some things have become clear. The backbone of support for Israel, unconditional support, are states led by the United States and most of the EU states, who are the custodians, the beneficiaries of the post-1945 so-called rules-based order. Bretton Woods and the IMF and the WTO, all of this has been, as is being pointed out, is a kind of domination of the rest, the West dominating the rest. And the continuing support for Israel, which is shocking, in this core of states, the architects of post-45 global order, are sometimes perverse, really perverse. I resigned from a research institution in Berlin, the WZB, very early on after October the 7th, and I have followed what German politicians have done since October the 7th. There's a kind of German syndrome, continue to ship armaments to those committing genocide, diplomatic support, moral complicity in this. Even German politicians, as we know, have been saying what others have not dared to say in the West, which is that, we have this historic commitment to Israel because of what we did to the Jews, and therefore doesn't follow, but therefore unconditionally we will back them to the hilt. This is one thing that has become, one dynamic I think that's become clearer, that we have a cluster of states that are shrinking actually in power globally, that are committed unconditionally to the continuation of this war on the West Bank and Gaza and other parts of the region. Second lesson, so to say, is the ugliness of the United States and Israel in all of this. The United States is at war in the Horn of Africa, the Gulf, in the west of Asia, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Ukraine, and this behavior of the United States, I think, is a turning point in the history of an empire that's in decline. This is one of the lessons that we're watching, so to say, live. A great moral crisis is developing, in which the post-45 Western order, compensation for what the Nazis and communists did against the Jews, welfare state capitalism, liberal democracy, rules-based order. All of this is crumbling, and I think Pankaj Mishra is one of the writers who correctly puts his finger on this second point. I think there's a third point, which is, to the surprise of many of us, whatever you think happened on the day of October the 7th, with Hamas and other militia and civilians pouring across a border, a fence, it has triggered so far one great victory, and that great victory is the moral condemnation of Israel and of genocide. It is raising all kinds of questions for many institutions, including universities, as Nick has just been pointing out. And the great moral trauma of this all is that a state that was born of genocide is itself committing a genocide. So the civil society uprisings that are happening in so many countries inside the West and beyond has put on the table, so to say, this question of how to make sense of that. Finally, I think that we're all pretty aware of the problem of the future of Israel. And I tread carefully here, but I think as an historian of the way that previous states that committed genocide were dealt with. How was there a reconstruction after genocide? Well, we have the cases of Germany and Japan flattened by bombs. This is not likely to happen, and it would not be welcome. The question is, I think coming out of October the 7th, the question is, what is the future of the state of Israel? And how will Palestinians, not just in diasporas everywhere, in Chile and elsewhere, survive? But how will the Palestinians in this area survive? And it seems to me what's developing, broadly speaking, is a split between those who think that there can be a Palestinian state which will be accepted by Israel. Nominally, many Western states have now signed up to that. It's a lot of hypocrisy. And what we are witnessing this week in the UN Security Council is a move by the United States, backed by Israel, to push a version of that independent state of Palestine.
This is incredibly dangerous resolution to be put forward. I think
Yes.
I think it requires a whole discussion because it's kind of entrenching an Oslo-like resolution on the Palestinians.
I mean, the vision is a US-backed occupation of Gaza, its separation from the rest of Palestine, a board of peace headed by Donald Trump,
yes,
etc. It's ludicrous. I hope it fails. What is the alternative? I'm not sure, but it does seem to me that strategies of humbling the state of Israel, of shaming the state of Israel and its people for their complicity in genocide, yes, is what is needed. And in this sense, boycotts and cutting ties are really important.
I really don't want to miss the opportunity to talk about what happened last weekend. So, Nick, over the weekend we saw the National Socialist Network rallying en masse outside the New South Wales Parliament. A Form 1 that submitted was approved by New South Wales Police. Just briefly tell everyone what was that assembly about, and just talk about the possible consequences of such assembly, and how does this incident, how does it compare to those accusations, of anti-Semitism leveled against you and John?
Yes, it's a very striking parallel, isn't it, Ahmed? I mean, for people who perhaps don't live in Sydney or haven't heard this, a neo-Nazi, the most consequential neo-Nazi grouping in Australia, the National Socialist Network, staged a disgusting stunt outside New South Wales Parliament a few days ago, where 60 or so black-clad goons lined up for a social media, sort of selfie with a horrific banner saying "Abolish the Jewish lobby," and they were, they had been given they had lodged a Form 1, which strictly speaking they didn't need. It was a static protest outside Parliament. They actually didn't need to submit any kind of notification to the police in order to hold that, but they did. The police didn't do what they have done so frequently when it's our side that is trying to demonstrate, which is drag us through the courts, negotiate with us to change the particular logistical details of the event. The police did none of that. They just said, yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir, and allowed the Nazis to assemble and get exactly the high kind of profile media stunt happening that they had intended to. And the political fallout has been intense ever since. I think for our purposes, the most useful thing to say is that we can see this precisely as evidence of exactly what we've been saying since October the 7th, 2023. People will remember, the dogged attempt that was made by Zionists to paint the Opera House March on, I think, October 10th, if I remember correctly, as anti-Semitic, with all sorts of lies about the slogans that were being articulated by the protesters on that occasion. So there's been this rash of false accusations of anti-Semitism, yet real anti-Semitism is not harassed at all, is not disrupted at all. The police give it a red flag. Now, I think we need to be very careful on the left and in the Palestine solidarity movement here. I am absolutely against any kind of strengthening of police powers of the kind that has been mooted in the wake of the National Socialist Network rally. I think we do need to have very principled commitment to free political expression. I think pragmatically, there is so much experience and history that suggests that the strengthening of laws of this kind just comes back to bite the left. It just comes back and will be used against us. So that's not what we should be calling for. What we should be calling for is decisive political action against all kinds of racial hatred. The Nazis were emboldened, I think, by not only by the normalization of 2 years of genocide, but by the brutal repression of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which is one of their own main targets. And they felt entirely validated by the state, I think, and saw that the political activities of federal and state governments in Australia had opened up a political space where it was possible for them to engage in an action like this, which was certainly controversial and certainly decried by establishment political actors who have never decried anti-Palestinianism, never decried Islamophobia with anything like the same tone or the same forcefulness. But the demonstration was it on the 8th, whenever it was one of the morbid symptoms, I think, of the political climate that political and social elites in this country have fostered and lovingly curated, and we need to stand against it absolutely decidedly.
Couldn't agree more. You said that anti-Semitism, and this is probably for John, if you want to have a go at this question. You said anti-Semitism is racial discrimination. Is anti-Semitism not persecution of Jewish people a religious group rather than a race? So that's the technical question of, what is anti-Semitism?
Yeah, it's a rather central issue to this case. I would say I tread a bit carefully because we're not meant to discuss the details of the case, but you've heard it all outside the courtroom, which is that, yes, we are Zionists. And by Zionism, we as Jews, this doesn't follow because there are a lot of non-Jewish Zionists, as Nick has already pointed out. There's even a platform, Musicians for Zionism. Bono, for example. But the reasoning is that as Zionists, as Jews, we are supporters of the political project of the establishment of Israel and its more or less unconditional protection through thick and thin against the lies of those who say that atrocities are being committed and land has been stolen, and lives have been ruined, and children are being murdered at an unprecedented rate. The trouble with this line of reasoning is that we think, and we are hoping we'll be vindicated on this, is that the case turns on a section of the Human Rights Act which specifies the meaning of racial hatred. And it does not include religion, and it does not include political views in favor of or against a government on our planet. So to put it more clearly, there is we think, a weakness in this general line of attack in this lawfare, which mixes together religion, a political commitment to a so-called nation state, and hatred of a racial group. This is a bundle of things that don't, of elements that don't actually congeal. So it's our hope that one of the effects of this case, victory in this case, will be to make the distinction very clear. We do not hate Jewish people. We have friends who are Jews. There are Jewish people who support us domestically and globally. The matter of belief in a God, or the matter of a political commitment to a state, a blind political commitment to a state for reasons of revenge and so on, these are separate. This is, it seems to us, one of the core elements of this case, one of the core principles.
That's why it's a really important question to address. I don't know if you have anything to add to this, Nick, but I do want to direct this question to you. I am mightily amused at these fools trying to get a linguist on the conflation of those two concepts, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. How do you feel about that, Nick?
Well, I don't think they're fools. That's the first thing to say. I think they're, very well funded, very, in many ways, strategic, deliberate, calculated political actors here. So I think it would be a mistake on our part. And I think, Jan, you probably just used fools as a derogatory term, which I'm completely on board with. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the amount of thought and the intent and the degree of planning that's gone into the case against John and me, even if we do, I think, feel, and everything we're told confirms this, even if we do feel that the case has a fundamental flaw right at the heart of it, which is the one that John has just outlined. I mean, for me, it is pretty weird to be in this situation because, as Jan has said, I do teach linguistics. In particular, I teach and research on a subfield of that discipline called semantics and pragmatics, which is about meaning in use and meaning in context. And so it's very strange for me to be embroiled in this legal debate, which turns on questions of what words mean, what the context is that they should be interpreted by, what the significance of particular definitions might be. All of these things are, questions that in many cases I've spent decades of my professional life reading about and reflecting on, and that I engage with students about on a quite regular basis. So it's just strange. I suppose it brings out the extent to which the law and popular discussion of these questions still rests sort of necessarily in many ways on extremely unsophisticated conceptions about what language is and how it works. If we, there's the level of generalization that this case is on is really quite breathtaking. The premise that it is possible to say that because of a particular utterance, a particular utterance type always inherently results in harm to a particular category of people is just an extraordinarily unsophisticated and, coarse and sort of dumb, I think, way of conceiving about what words are and how they work. And that's of professional interest to me, if nothing else.
Could I say a little bit to Ben, and in adding to what Nick has said? I mean, you could think of it this way without forgetting that this is a case about genocide and the horrors of this genocide. Our courtroom case is a classification struggle. It's a struggle to define words, and it's necessarily a struggle about power. And what we're hoping to do is, in this case, is to establish in law for the whole country distinctions that are currently willfully being confused. Mm-hmm. There is something else about this classification struggle. Perhaps those who are watching and listening at the moment have never quite thought this, but powerful groups, have a material interest in keeping their identity, their boundaries fuzzy. It's a great idea of Pierre Bourdieu, a great French intellectual. And what we are doing in this case, I think it will be one of the effects, and I'm hoping for victory, of course, is to expose publicly who exactly is funding this. What is this Group 5A, and so on. So it is indeed, this case is not simply a case about legal matters, it's a struggle over language, semantics, as Nick says very rightly.
Interesting way of looking at things. There's a really good question here about the IHRA definition. We haven't spoken much about it. Maybe this is a good opportunity to talk, which of those universities have adopted the IHRA definition and which not, of anti-Semitism, that is, and what are the ramifications? Maybe I can start with you, Nick, if we could be a bit brief and succinct.
I'll be a bit brief necessarily because I can't quite remember. Not all Australian universities have adopted the IHRA definition. Universities Australia, which is the so-called peak body that brings university managements together into a cozy little cabal, they have adopted the definition, but individual institutions need to adopt it themselves. Universities Australia adopted it under the guise of a very similar definition, which is, substantively does all the same things as the IHRA definition itself, but is slightly differently worded. University of Sydney adopted it immediately. Some universities, I think I'm right in saying that UTS hasn't adopted it. I think there is perception in universities about what a sort of ticking bomb it is and what a booby trap it is, in that if it was taken literally, it would really outlaw what is entirely legitimate academic discussion about the status of Israel, the crime of genocide, Zionism, Judaism, and any host of, no doubt, of other questions. So it is deeply, corrosive of the kinds of free inquiry that universities need to have. I think to some extent universities are aware of this, and even those that have adopted it nominally are going to be careful about how they use it. But in many ways, the chilling effect has already happened. I know of changes in curriculum which have been imposed at the University of Sydney, in some cases, self-imposed, out of concerns for the implications of this new definition. So there is an epistemicidal, if we can use that word. There is a destruction of knowledge and a destruction of inquiry that this definition is responsible for, whether or not it's enforced, overtly by those universities that have adopted it.
For the sole purpose of silencing criticism of a foreign country. I mean, 7 of the 11 examples in that definition are criticism of Israel. What are your thoughts, John?
My worry is that the Australian dynamic is more insidious than that of the American dynamic. I mean, what we all know is that the Trump administration is rounding on a whole clutch of universities, and to the surprise of many observers and many academics and students, there are universities like Columbia that bow down. They not only pay money, to the Trump administration, but they agree to epistemic czars to come in and to be, the monitors of courses, the shutdown of departments, the elimination of certain staff. I mean, this is all very brazen, and it has potentially an unlimited repertoire. I think Berkeley is in the firing line at the moment. My fear is that that the university administrators themselves, the senior management, backed by government and by Zionist lobby groups, will actually have the same effect, and it'll all happen much more silently without much fuss. So one significance of this case, without being at all narcissistic, is that University of Sydney is targeted for a particular reason, and it's why we must win. Because actually it would be a reversal of that process. It would be a great defeat intellectually, morally, and politically for that kind of Americanization of Australian universities. I never saw anything like this in my life. Not even during the Vietnam period. There was none of this kind of IHRA type sympathy where kowtowing to a foreign government, it's just astonishing. And we are hoping our case will help in a small way to defeat this.
Fingers crossed. I want to go to the last contribution from Professor Ahmed Shboul. He's saying, how do you explain university administration attitude? Why are they so immoral?
Well, John has indicated he'd like me to get
You
started with that.
yes.
I mean, I think you're right, Ahmed. They are immoral. What we've seen since October the 7th, I think, has been a global phenomenon, which is by no means, of which Australia is just an example. The global managerial professional class, with not very many exceptions, has closed ranks behind Israel decisively. We see it in university administrations, we see it in the media, we see it in arts organizations, in public administration. There has been this concerted attempt to suppress any flickerings of, of the expression of the idea that perhaps genocide is wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to look to understand why this is the case, to the kinds of, political and organizational and social structures that universities and similar organizations are embedded in, and ask the question, what kind of political dispositions, what kind of people get elevated to the leadership of these organizations? And I think that it's very clearly on show in universities that you don't get to head these organizations if you have opinions that depart even an iota from maybe they can depart an iota. They can't depart in any significant way from the sort of, deadening liberal mainstream consensus that we see in the center of Australian politics. And support for Israel is deeply embedded in that. The other thing that you can't do if you're a university chief is be too outspoken or loud about the desperately underfunded state that, Australian universities are in. It's a fact that is just utterly remarkable to me that, well, it's not remarkable, it's what you'd expect, that university administrators have been complicit and have collaborated and have facilitated the bleeding dry of their institutions by one government after another for decades and decades. And one of the reasons that they are elevated to those positions is that the university boards, which are largely appointed and which are largely, constituted by business people and government appointees, have no interest in a leader of a university that's gonna rattle the cage even a little bit about something as essential as university funding. Why would they rattle it over Israel? Compliance, conformism, getting a star from their boards and their executives, fulfilling their KPIs, taking home their massive paychecks. These are these people's priorities. They don't care about education. In the case of the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney, he has never even worked in university, doesn't have any sort of serious higher degree, knows nothing, evidently seems to get most of his information about what's happening on campus from the front page of the Australian. So it's not, any surprise that they've reacted in this way, I don't think. And there's nothing particular about the Sydney University leadership here. They're absolutely typical exemplars of their particular political class, I would say.
May I just add a few seconds?
Please, yes, yeah.
I had the dubious honor of delivering an online lecture to Berlin to a consortium of universities, the Humboldt and the Free University, WZB, and other institutions. And just before the lecture was due to start, police actually raided a number of the universities. The students very cleverly just then disaggregated and went to cafes, and we went ahead For me, it was the beginning of thinking about what's happening to our universities and what October the 7th and beyond is teaching us about the degradation of universities that Nick has just been speaking of. It's not time for a lecture on the history of universities, but it's worth bearing in mind that the first universities, Chinese and Islamic, were moral universities. They were committed to the teaching of ethics, and practical matters were of secondary importance. Then around 1800 is born the whole ideal of the Ivory Tower University, where the church and business and the state are meant to keep out of this. These two models of the university clearly are obsolete. There then came in the 1960s, just before I went to university, the idea that of the multiversity, that the university would be a place where indeed government played a role and indeed business played a role, but there would also be a sector of public, open public commitment and public discussion to the public good. What I think October the 7th has done for me, and I think for many friends and colleagues, I think including Nick, is it's forced the realization that our universities have become hostages of government policies, of armaments production, of diplomatic connections, that they are part of a military-industrial academic complex, to use the phrase. They have also become intensely businesses, the commodification of universities. And it's a key reason for me, with a new management style that plays out this strange crushing of public commitment, of public knowledge, public commitment to public controversies. They have no interest in this. They are principally interested in public reputation management and the minimization of public reputation, disreputation. And this case at a university that a lot of Australians are doubtful about because it's so, up its own backside and so on, nevertheless is a case to actually challenge that dynamic, at least as far as I understand it. I think Nick agrees about this.
Unfortunately, so in the last couple of minutes, I just want to ask each one of you, or if you both can come up with an answer to the following question: how do we stay informed with the progress of your lawsuit?
Yes, that's a good question. I think the best way is to give a little bit of money to the Chuffed account. It just can be $1, it can be 50 cents, and you'll get updates. So we update that, and that's the main page that we use to keep people informed about what's happening. And we put an update about the fact that we're about to be in court in 3/4 of an hour. So I think that's the best. Or follow John and me on social media.
And the justice in charge of this case rightly rules that it's of public interest and public importance. And so if you've got nothing better to do, you can watch live this afternoon's.
Can you?
Yes, I think so.
Can.
I think so. Yes, it says so.
Court documents.
And the court documents are all available. And the other bit of advice is, please don't read the Australian or the Telegraph or other rags, because the level of misreporting it gives journalism a bad name. We had the experience in the early morning of the most recent 2-day hearings, in which the Australian journalist came and wrote a short report that bore no correspondence to what actually happened in the court, and said that this was our case was motivated by support or inspired by support for a Muslim preacher, who was accused of racial hatred. This is just total nonsense. So. Stay away and don't read those.
They're not interested in the details, I would say. I can't thank you enough, John and Nick, for being part of this conversation today. It's really enlightening for everyone to understand what we're up against. So thank you. Thank you for spending the time with me.
Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you very much also.
You've been listening to The Palestinian Show, Red Inverted Triangle. If you'd like to learn more about Palestine, or if you'd like to get involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, please follow Palestine Justice Movement Sydney on Instagram or Facebook. And keep tuning in to Red Inverted Triangle. My name is Ahmed. I will see you next time.